Russia again blames Israel for its role in the recent downing of its jet in Syria. It's a new low in a relationship that's endured and even thrived despite opposing agendas on multiple fronts. So will Moscow curb Israel's actions in Syria? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. Russia is the main ally of Syrian President Bashar al-assad, who Israel has repeatedly targeted. Russia sells arms to Iran and supports the nuclear deal with Tehran, which Israel has vociferously lobbied against. But Russia and Israel had steered clear of confronting each other. That changed last Monday when Syrian government forces mistook a Russian reconnaissance plane for an Israeli jet and shot it down, killing all 15 people on board. The Russian Defense Ministry says Israeli fighter jets deliberately used the Russian plane as cover. We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, here's more of what the spokesman had to say.
I would like to emphasize the fact that the Israeli jets saw the Russian Il-20 and used it as a shield against the anti-aircraft missiles while they carried on maneuvering in the region. The misleading information provided by the Israeli officer about the area of strikes did not allow the Russian Il-20 aircraft to move timely to a safe area. The presented objective data testify that the actions of Israeli fighter pilots, which led to the loss of life of 15 Russian servicemen, either lack professionalism or were an act of criminal negligence, to say the least.
Well, the Israeli military insists that it's not to blame, saying it did not hide behind any aircraft. Russia, though, is calling Israel's actions an extremely ungrateful response to the operational deals that the two sides have struck in Syria. And now Moscow is supplying Syria with its sophisticated S-300 anti-aircraft missile system, which it had held back for many years. Let's take a closer look now at the relations between Russia and Israel. Moscow reportedly struck a deal with Israel this year, keeping Iranian and Lebanese Hezbollah fighters away from the Israeli-occupied Golden Heights. And it's allowed dozens of Israeli airstrikes inside Syria, despite having a base there with radars and surface-to-air missiles that could intercept airstrikes. Military coordination has come with a warm relationship between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Russian leader Vladimir Putin, and Israel has stayed away from Western sanctions on Russia. Well, let's introduce our guests now. Joining us from Moscow is Samuel Ramani, a specialist on Russia and Middle East relations and a contributor at the Russian International Affairs Council think tank. In Muscat is Hushang Hassan Yari, a professor of military and international relations at Sultan Qaboos University. And in Tel Aviv is Asaf Ronel, a journalist at Haaretz newspaper and its former World News editor. A very warm welcome to all of you. Mr. Ramani, let me start with you in Moscow. The strongest condemnation so far from the Russian Defense Ministry. How serious an impact do you think this incident has had on Russia-Israel relations?
I think that this has had quite a serious impact on Russia-Israel relations because ever since the September of 2015, there's been an informal agreement between the Russians and the Israelis. The Israelis do not violate the deconfliction zone in exchange for the Russians working and lobbying with their allies, Iran and Hezbollah, to ensure that no attack has been made on Israel. From Russia's position, they believe that they have upheld the bargain, but they believe that Israel has not. And this breach of trust has created quite a significant rift, particularly within the Russian Defense Ministry, according to some of my contacts in the ministry.
Mr. Ronel, the two countries' accounts just don't add up. Israel does not agree at all with the Russian Defense Ministry statement. What's going on here?
I think that, first of all, both countries are known for not always sticking to the actual truth, especially when regards to military actions. But in this case, at least as most, or if not all, experts in Israel and military experts, the Israeli version seems more reliable. The Israelis had no interest in provoking the Russians to or causing any harm to the Russians, because they know that they are relying on the Russians to continue their free reign in the Syrian airspace. So it seems that the situation is a bit more complex. I think, in my perspective, that the Russians are using this incident, first of all, to transfer blame from themselves and from their allies. There are Russian experts that are sitting inside the Syrian air defense apparatus, and they are helping them. So maybe there was even Russian involvement in shooting the missiles. So they are trying to divert blame for the death of their soldiers. And also, the situation in Syria is changing now. Assad's regime is almost secured. It's secured and it controls almost all of the all of Syria. And the Russians are now trying to change the playground, to redefine the rules of engagement in Syrian airspace, which in the past 6 years, the Israelis have been doing all they wanted in the Syrian airspace, attacking any target that they wanted, at least according to the reports of hundreds of airstrikes. And now the Russians are trying to redefine the rules and saying that the Israelis cannot act as freely as they did in the past. And this incident fits them very well to change this situation.
Mr. Hassan Yari, is that what's going on here? And Russia is using this unfortunate incident to change the rules of engagement in Syria as the war comes to an end?
That might be the case, but I believe a relationship between Russia and Israel, they were very, very well. As my colleagues mentioned, in the past many years, Russians almost turned their head the other way, let the Israelis take care of the Iranian forces and the Hezbollah as they wanted to. I think this mistake by the Israelis, if the Moscow's version is correct, this mistake by the Israelis not to coordinate better with the Russians is going to cost Israel dearly. We should not forget that in the past few months, the Israelis conducted so many attacks on the Iranian forces in Syria and Hezbollah as well, without any kind of intervention by Russians. Actually, I believe that Russians opened the door for the Israelis to do that. But
well, that
with
might
this situation,
be, and that door might be about to close, because just today we had the Russian Defense Ministry announcing that they're going to now, the Russian government announcing that they're now going to supply the Syrian government with these anti-missile defense systems that they previously hadn't. Mr. Ramani, is this to keep Russian planes safe or to curtail Israel's freedom of movement in Syria?
I think that this is a two-pronged message. Firstly, it is to keep Russian jets safe, because they've argued that the S-200's radius and zone of influence is inadequate, and the S-300s can extend to 250 kilometers, which would give them a greater degree of security. But I also think that this is a warning shot that's being fired at Israel. Much like the way Russia did not react very strongly to the Americans allegedly killing 300 Russian mercenaries a few months back, Russia is basically trying to warn Israel that if there is another violation of the deconfliction zone, there will be serious consequences, and making an unprecedented step by delivering equipment that was only been used by the Russian military to another force and one of Israel's arch enemies, Bashar al-Assad, is a very clear way of making that warning shot.
Mr. Vernel, how do you think Israel is going to respond now to these anti-missile defense systems being deployed to Syria? Israel's former military intelligence chief, Amos Yadlin, has said that he assumes that the Air Force will destroy the S-300 if it's handed over to Syria. What do you make of that?
I think that the situation in Syria has become more complicated for the Israeli Air Force. Previous declarations and reports from inside the Israeli army indicate that the Israelis believe they can work around the S-300 if it is deployed in Syria and still achieve their goals. It might be more complicated, it might be more risky, but they will achieve their goals. Israel in the past clarified that every air defense system that is attacking its jets will be attacked, and as it happened in the past. And so the possibility, I'm not sure that it will be a preemptive attack, but if those systems will be activated against Israeli jets, it is very likely that the Israeli jets will attack them in return and destroy them. which might create even a more complicated situation, because last time the Russians discussed supplying the S-300 to Syria, they also warned anyone from trying to attack those systems. So there is a the chances for further complications are growing, and the situation is getting even more blurred. Also for the Israeli Air Force. But I don't think that the Israelis will let go of achieving their goals, which is, according to the Israeli statements and reports and everything, to limit the Iranian military presence in Syria, and the transport of advanced weapons from Iran to pro-Iranian militias in Syria and to the Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Mr. Hassan Yari, so given that, so Israel is going to continue with its operations, Russia now could be trying to, is it going to try and limit Israel's operations or engage with it more, engage in more diplomatic coordination in Syria? How is it going to use this incident as leverage?
I think this incident could be really a turning point in the situation in Syria, but also in what the Israelis can do in the future. We should recall also what the Ministry of Defense in Moscow said, that they are going to integrate their defense, the anti-air system with the Syrians. It means that Russian soldiers will be with the Syrians operating S-300, and that will make it extremely difficult really for the Israelis to attack such a system, knowing that the Russians are going to be implicated. So all of that to say, in the absence of any kind of Russian agreement to let the Israelis do basically what they wanted to do, we are going to see a situation much, much more complicated than before. And that is going to serve, obviously, the Iranian interest in Syria, the Syrian government and Hezbollah, and consequently will limit, I believe, the margin for the Israelis to maneuver as they used to.
The Israelis do have some considerable leverage with the Russians, though. Mr. Ramani, how much action, can Russia take against Israel, given things like, we heard from Israeli Minister Avigdor Lieberman earlier this year, who was very quick to remind Russia that Israel didn't join in Western sanctions against Russia for its actions in Crimea. It didn't kick Russian ambassadors and diplomats out of its country like a lot of other countries did following the poisoning of the former Russian spy in England.
I think Israel has many points of leverage with regards to Russia. First of all, and most proximate, is that Israel can launch another set of airstrikes against Assad's military defenses or against Iranian military defenses in southern Syria. That could kill many Iranian Revolutionary Guard members who are vital for Russia's military campaign, like May 10th. That's the most proximate example. In other ways, Israel is important to Russia because it's a major trade partner in the Middle East. It's also a very important partner for Russia's broader collective security goal. Russia wants to be involved, ideally, in mediating and engaging in dialogue on one of two major conflicts, Israel and Iran, Iran and Saudi Arabia, and trying to leverage a strong relationship with all these powers. If the relationship between Israel and Russia were to be breached, its broader diplomatic goals for a long-term foothold in the Middle East would be greatly diminished. So I think that maintaining a good relationship with Israel is paramount, and that ultimately Russia will probably try to warn and more gradually chastise Israel rather than cut off relations or escalate more drastically, because it doesn't want retaliation from Jerusalem.
But will Russia, Mr. Ramani, continue to, turn the other way as it has been so far in this conflict? It doesn't sound like it's going to at all from what our other guests are saying.
I think that the Russian Defense Ministry certainly will be a lot more aggressive towards Israel for a period of time. And Russia could retaliate by potentially not supporting Israel on UN resolutions about the settlements. It could retaliate by more directly providing military assistance to Iran. That could be threatening and quite scary for Israel. But I think in the very long term, if you're looking past a few months, I think ultimately there will be some kind of a normalization and some kind of a consensus will be reached regarding deconfliction. And this kind of crisis will ultimately simmer down, with a warning that if Israel violates the deconfliction zone again, the consequences will be much more severe.
Mr. Vanel, what do you make of that? Is this just, a minor hiccup in the historic relationship between these two countries?
I think that, first of all, the relations are bigger than in Syria, and I think that, as it has been said before, Israel has ability to hurt Syrian interests in the region and around the world. And I think also it's worth reminding that the Iranians and Russians are fighting the same side in Syria, but their interests are not always the same. In a way, there is even a competition between Iran and Russia about their presence and their influence over the Syrian regime, over the Assad regime, once the war is over, right now and once the war is over. And I'm not sure that Putin and the Russian military was very unpleased with the fact that the Israelis were attacking Iranian targets in Syria throughout those past 6 years, because in a way, as long as it didn't hurt the direct military effort of the Assad regime, it helped. It might have helped Russian interests in limiting the Iranian presence in Syria, which you can claim that the Russians are not completely happy with it, because they want to be the hegemonic force, the only hegemonic force in Syria, or at least the most important force in Syria, and limiting Iranian presence there via Israeli airstrikes could have been seen as useful. And I'm not sure this equation changed so much. I think that still there is a struggle between Russia and Iran about who will control Syria once the war is over. And I think that the Russians might want to continue using the Israeli airstrikes as a tool in this struggle.
Mr. Hassanyari, what do you make of that? Is Russia using Israeli airstrikes as a tool in the conflict? And also, how long do you think will the Syrian government continue to also essentially allow Israel to carry out attacks on its allies, on Iran, on Hezbollah targets, on its territory?
There is no doubt that Tehran is very, very upset about what Russians are doing really in Syria, and also their complacency toward the Israeli attacks. For example, Iranians are in Syria because Syria is, for them, it's a strategic ally. They want to be there. They need Syria in order to reach Lebanon, Hezbollah, and the border with Israel. The Iranians are not going to be pushed out very easily. But what the Russian president said in the past few months, that all foreign forces should leave Syria, was received very negatively in Tehran. So this is why I believe it was, from day one, it was a big mistake by Tehran to put all its eggs in the Russian side of the equation, and consequently now they have to regret it. But what is important, and if we make a connection between the recent incident and the past many years of nuclear negotiations, Russians always use the Iranian card to put pressure on the US, on Europeans, and get concessions from there. And I believe they are going to do the same thing here. On one hand, the Iranians, because of their isolation, they need Russian backing, Russian arms more than before. And on the other hand, they cannot completely go the way that the Russians do not agree with. So this is why the Iranians are cornered, and the Russians are using this situation in order to consolidate their presence and their domination in the region. And so I believe with the American retreat, with the Russians digging in the region, we are going to see a reconfiguration of the geostrategic map of the region, where Russians are going to be the dominant, and then the other states are going to be used by Russians wherever the Russians' interests dictate that.
So, Mr. Ramani, I mean, that sounds like it's good news from Russia, whichever way you look at it. You know, it can balance all these different interests with Iran, with Syria, with Israel, because of the power that it has right now.
Yes, Russia has given itself a position of indispensability, and it will remain an adherent to the doctrine of having no problems with your neighbors, basically a perfect application of that doctrine, by working with both Israel and Iran. And it's also important to keep in mind that at the Helsinki summit, Putin acknowledged behind the scenes that he has really no leverage over Iranian presences in southern Syria. So there are a lot of disagreements between Iran and Russia over Syria and other crises too, like Yemen and Afghanistan, that could make that relationship considerably weaker, along with the economic competition over natural gas. And I think that it's important to keep in mind that Russia will probably hedge in the Middle East, balance between de-escalate with Israel eventually, keep a good relationship with Iran, rather than picking sides, because hedging is the best strategy for its overall geopolitical agenda.
Mr. Ronald, what do you make of that? Is Russia going to be able to balance all of these often opposing interests?
I think that the chances for further complications are greater than they used to be, on the one hand, but I think that there is no other superpower that will be able to stop Russia from doing whatever it wants here. The Americans are almost insignificant in Syria. Their only energies are diverted towards destroying what's left of the Iran nuclear deal. If we're talking about the Middle East policy, there isn't much left more than that. I think that there are growing chances for further complications on a tactical level. But I agree that in the long run, the Russians will continue balancing the different interests of the different powers that they are dealing with in the Middle East for their own gains. But still, the question is whether they will allow Iranians to continue entrenching militarily in Syria against Israeli wishes, and will they allow the Iranians to do it under the new limitations that they will apply on the Israeli activity in the Syrian airspace, and how will Israel react? Because I don't think that the Israelis will let go of their interest of stopping Iranian presence in Syria. If the Russians will accommodate that, which is not unlikely, then the situation will continue in this balance. But it is a fragile balance, and the Russians will have to continue applying very sophisticated diplomatic and strategic means to keep it stable.
And Mr. Hassan Yari, you know, as Russia continues to gain, who else gains in this situation?
In this situation, I believe the new friends of Israel in the region, they are going to have some difficulties really to do whatever they want, the positioning themselves in the region. For example, Saudi Arabia and rapprochement with Russia was seen very negatively by Iran. If this confrontation between, or if this dispute with the Israelis gets out of hand and Russians try to push the Israelis somehow to corner them, then that would also create some uncomfortable situation for Syria. So I believe those who gain from this situation in the region are not too many. Obviously, Assad is not a very popular president among the Arabs in the region. Many of them, they don't want to see Assad in power, but also they don't want to see Iranian interference in Syria, in the Arab capitals, Arab affairs as they call it. And consequently, the situation will be quite different. This is why I'm talking about reconfiguration of the region. And in this new region, Russia is going to have an upper hand. For how long, we don't know, unless the Americans get back and then they try to play their historical and traditional role.
Mr. Hassan Yari, thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I'd like to thank all of our guests, Samuel Ramani in Moscow, Hushang Hassan Yari in Muscat, and Asaf Ronal in Tel Aviv. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, al-jazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the whole team here, bye for now.